Our plenary speaker this afternoon is Lindsey Burke. Lindsey Burke is the director of the Center for Educational Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where she oversees Heritage's research and policy on issues pertaining to preschool, K through 12, and higher education reform. Burke's research has been presented at academic conferences and published in peer-reviewed journals, including Social Science Quarterly, Educational Research and Evaluation, and the Journal for School Choice. Her commentary and op-eds have appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers. She is a frequent guest on radio and television shows and speaks on education reform issues across the country and internationally. She has published evaluations of educational choice options for public policy foundations across the country, and she's done extensive research and help in shaping educational savings accounts across the country. So please join me in welcoming Lindsey Burke.
Great, well, thank you very much. Really looking forward to being here today, and having to take a hard left out of the front explains why I have not yet found the stadium. I don't know how to do that. So welcome, everybody. We are at just an incredible time in terms of education reform. Just to put a finer point on it, today, just a few hours ago, Governor Jeff Landry in Louisiana signed a universal education savings account bill into law in that state. I'll talk more about it in a minute, but Louisiana now marks the 11th state with universal school choice. 3 years ago, that number was 0. So we have made tremendous progress in a very short amount of time. So hence the title of the talk today, "The Dam Truly is Breaking," when it comes to education freedom. But before we get there, so you may have seen this before. This is from economist Mark Perry, who's at the American Enterprise Institute. Perry took a page out of an old 1960s Sears catalog and showed in inflation-adjusted dollars what it would have cost you then to buy this beautiful black and white, or color TV in this case, in this beautiful but old and clunky TV set. $5,300 in 2010 dollars. So then he said, well, what could you get today for the equivalent of $5,300? Well, you could get a washer and dryer, a refrigerator, an oven, a flat screen TV, but wait, there's more. You could also get a smartphone. You could get a laptop. You could get all of those electronics that you see before you. Of course, illustrating the point that prices have gotten cheaper as the quality of goods and services have gotten better. So if we think about whether or not that extends to technology, we can see pretty clearly that it does. If you consider what it would have cost you in 1981 to buy 1 gigabyte of storage, it would have cost you $300,000 in 1981. By 2012, that had dropped to 10 cents. It's phenomenal progress that we've seen in technological improvements. So our day-to-day goods, technology, all of this has gotten cheaper as improvements have come alongside. But what about your daily consumption of more basic needs, food, for instance? Well, we see the same positive phenomenon here as well. If you go back to 1950, the peak there on that chart, in 1950, American households were spending about 25% of their discretionary income on food every month. By 2010, that had dropped to about 7% of a family's discretionary income. Now, let's set aside for a second the current Biden economy that we're living in, and we might be closer to 25% again, but that is to say, where we are today, it's actually much, much cheaper in terms of what we spend as a proportion of our discretionary budget monthly on food. Now, you can anticipate where I'm going with this. Have we seen the same types of reductions in price and improvements in goods and services in K-12 education over that time period? We have not. So if we look at spending from the 1970s forward, and I know this is a little difficult to see on the slides here, but we have increased per pupil spending about 192% since the 1970s. So this is your total per pupil spending, 1970 to 2010. What you see on the bottom there, that orange and green line, is your math improvement and reading improvement over the same time period. It has been effectively flat. We've seen roughly a 2% improvement in math achievement and a 0.7% improvement in reading achievement over the same time period. We're spending a lot of money. We spend about $18,000 per pupil per year now in the public school system nationally across the country. Of course, I know your schools are much more efficient and spend far less than that, but if we're just looking at national per pupil spending in the public sector, it's about $18,000 all in federal, state, and local per pupil per year. So we're spending a tremendous amount of money. So we must be getting something for all of this increase in spending. We are. We're getting a lot of non-teaching administrative bloat. Total staff from 1970 to 2015 increased 83% in public schools across the country, your typical public school district. Now, if we break that down a little bit, what we can see is that teaching staff represents about a 52% increase over that time period. So we've seen a 52% increase in teaching staff from 1970 to 2015 in school districts, public school districts across the country. Non-teaching staff, though, has increased 133% over that time period. To put it differently, if you went all the way back to 1950, there were about 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher in a given school district in the country. Today, it's about 1-to-1. 1-to-1 on average in your typical school district. Now, what is most notable, if you look at that gray line on the bottom, that is your increase, or lack thereof, in student enrollment in these same schools. We've seen about a 9% increase in student enrollment from 1970 to 2015. Now, one could argue that part of that increase was appropriate. If we go back to about 1970, where we see a significant increase in the number of non-teaching staff, part of that reflects, finally, students with special needs getting the attention and the services that they deserved and needed. And so we did see an increase in paraprofessionals and non-traditional teachers to reflect improvements in students with special needs and the services that they had access to. But those increases continued far beyond the 70s. They really exploded throughout the 1990s. So the special needs component cannot explain the overall 133% increase in non-teaching staff since that time. This is only going to get much, much worse. School districts received $190 billion in COVID relief funds, which was an unprecedented sum for them to receive. Now, school districts were supposed to, traditional public schools, use this $190 billion on things like tutoring services, on one-time expenses to help offset some of the issues that we saw in the wake of COVID. But what did they do? They did not use that money for one-time expenses. They made permanent decisions with temporary COVID relief funds. Between 40 and 50% of those funds were spent on labor costs, including counselors and learning specialists. And that's according to Georgetown University. So about 40 to 50%, about half of their COVID dollars were spent on permanent staffing decisions. Now, that money is about to run out. Schools are going to have to make some tough choices, public schools, about what they're going to do in the wake of that $190 billion running dry. Now, couple those permanent increases, with rapidly declining student enrollment. It's if you look at student enrollment over time, my former colleague Jude Schwalbach points out public school enrollment is down about 4 percentage points across the country relative to pre-pandemic levels. My colleague Matt Ladner contrasts that with the current baby boomer retirement situation we're also facing. So we have baby boomer retirement, a boom in baby boomer retirement, coupled with a baby bust at the same time. So we have 10,000 baby boomers reaching the age of 65 every single day from now until 2030. Largely, those are the individuals exiting the workforce and paying less into the tax system. Couple that with the birth rate decline that we're seeing across the country, a 23% decline since 2007. So there will be ubiquitous declines in K-12 enrollment across the states by 2030. We're about to experience a very large increase in the American elderly population and a large decrease in birth rates. So this creates significant demographic challenges for public schools that ultimately affects their bottom line. On the point about hiring non-teaching staff and just making these permanent staffing decisions with temporary COVID funds, researcher Chad Outerman estimates that school districts would have to cut 384,000 positions to get back to their pre-pandemic staffing levels. So we're talking about massive numbers in terms of what public schools nationally decided to do with those temporary COVID relief funds. So what does all of this mean? It means this chart is about to get a lot worse as well. I don't know if anybody's seen this before. This is again from Mark Perry over at the American Enterprise Institute, but it has been labeled the chart of the century. So this chart of the century simply shows selected US consumer goods and services relative to inflation. So on the top there in red, we have things like hospital services, college tuition and fees, college textbooks, childcare. And then on the bottom in blue, where you see these declines in prices, and this, again, is contrast with overall inflation, right? So red is increasing at a rate far beyond inflation. On the bottom there, we have things like new cars and household furnishings and clothing, cell phones, electronics, TVs, toys. So pop quiz, what do the things on the top have in common? Any brave souls out there? That's it. They're subsidized, right? These are the things that are largely subsidized by government, right? Hospital services, college tuition, right? We're dropping money out of airplanes onto universities, to quote Rich Vedder at the University of Ohio, right? They are swimming in things like PLUS loans and direct loans and indirect cost subsidies, research, federal research grants, $50 billion endowments if you're Harvard, right? So these are highly, highly subsidized institutions and services. And so they've gotten more expensive over time. Well, that's going to come to an end very soon, right? We will no longer be in the position, thanks to that baby boomer retirement boom and the baby bust, where we can continue to spend the way that we've been spending at public institutions, both K-12 and higher education historically. So states have to do something, and they are doing something in the arena of K-12 education. This is a really sophisticated slide. I hope you can wrap your head around it. So this is the state of Arizona. So in 2011, Arizona became the first state to adopt an education savings account. You're all probably familiar at this point with what an education savings account is, but in the event you're not, compare that to a traditional school voucher. Everybody knows how a voucher works. A voucher is basically a coupon to pay for tuition at a given private school of choice. It's a great option. We have many states that have school voucher programs. If you compare how a voucher functions, though, with an education savings account, an ESA is much more like an Amazon gift card. It still pays for tuition at a single private school, but you can also use it for many other education-related services and products and providers. So you can pay private school tuition, but then you can hire a private tutor, you can pay for online learning, you can buy textbooks, you can roll over unused funds from year to year. This is the real innovation behind an ESA relative to a traditional school voucher or to a traditional tax credit scholarship option. It has all of these incentives built in to encourage families to not only find a good product, but to find that good product at a good price point. Often, as you know, private school tuition becomes more expensive as you grow through the years, right, from kindergarten on through middle school and high school. So giving families the option to roll over that money year to year and to even roll it into a college savings account is really a critical refinement of that original school voucher idea that Milton Friedman put forward in 1955. If you've never had the chance to read The Role of Government in Education that Friedman put out in 55, it's a short, pithy little, I think 6-page treatise or so that was the basis for the modern day school voucher idea. It was in that essay that Milton Friedman said, yes, we will publicly finance K-12 education, but the public financing of education does not require government delivery of schooling. So we should separate the financing of education from the delivery, and he operationalized that idea with a school voucher. And so that was 1955, and it really remained an academic idea from 1955 until about 1990. And in 1990-91, we get the first modern-day school voucher program in Wisconsin. And then throughout the 90s, we get a few others here and there, Pennsylvania, Ohio, we get some tax credit scholarship options, but it was a pretty slow trickle in terms of school choice adoption in the states. And then in 2011, we get Arizona with its first education savings account, and we had 11 states that year adopt some form of private school choice. The Wall Street Journal called it that year the year of school choice. So Arizona's ESA, as I said, was a critical refinement of that original school voucher idea. What I think is so interesting about Milton Friedman, he puts out that original essay in 1955. He was still thinking about this all the way until the early 2000s, right? Friedman passed away in, I believe it was 2006. He gave an interview with the education industry journal Education Next just a few months prior to that, with a woman named Pearl Rock Kane. And in that essay, he said, you know, my voucher idea is great, but why should you have to spend all of your voucher at one single school? Why not math at one school and science at another? Why not partial vouchers? And so he put out this concept of partial vouchers, which really did become the intellectual groundwork for education savings accounts. And so it was the Goldwater Institute in Arizona that took that idea and ran with it and ultimately got it adopted legislatively. And so today in Arizona, if you choose as a parent, you get 90% of what the state would have spent on your child in a public school, and it goes directly onto a debit card, right? So 90% of your state per pupil funding on a debit card with your child's name on it. You have 4 children, 4 different debit cards with their names on it, with 90% of your state per pupil funding. So there's no federal money involved, there's no local dollars implicated, it's just your state per pupil spending. On average, for your median student in Arizona, that means about $7,400 this year in your ESA. It's weighted, so for kids with special needs, that median amount is much higher, closer to $15,000 per student per year. We worked with a family in Arizona, one of the first families to begin participating in 2011, and the student's name was Max Ashton. And Max is legally blind. He's been completely blind since birth. And so when the ESA program came to be in 2011, they said, we want to participate in this. They were fairly happy with their public school, but they wanted something more. And so Max enters the program. He gets 90% of his state per pupil funding on his debit card. And for Max, since he was legally blind, he was getting some of the higher amounts in their formula in Arizona. So they were getting about $20,000 per year in their ESA, which again, remember, is just 90% of just the state spending on Max that would have happened in the public system. So he got that. They enrolled Max at Brophy Academy, a private school in Arizona, which they loved. They paid their private school tuition. He was able to get everything that he needed to be successful as a blind student, a talking computer, Braille textbooks, everything else he needed to assist him. They still had thousands of dollars left over every year, which his family would roll over every year. Max graduates from Brophy Academy, goes to Loyola Marymount University in California, takes his Arizona state per pupil dollars with him on his ESA, and pays his tuition in California. This is phenomenal. Yeah, thank you. It's amazing, right? I mean, this is how we should fund K-12 education. Fund the student, not the physical school building, and allow families to decide what works for them. I mentioned earlier that something like an ESA helps align incentives appropriately. This is where Friedman got it right as well. You may have seen, Milton Friedman has a great chart where he says there are 4 ways that you can spend money. A few of you may have seen this before, but Friedman says, you can spend your own money on yourself, you can spend your own money on somebody else, you can spend somebody else's money on yourself, or you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. So how do public schools spend money? They spend it in that last way, right? The worst way you can spend money. They spend somebody else's money on somebody else's children. So you have no incentive to economize value or to find really good services and options. With an ESA, with school choice broadly, but in particular with an ESA, because you can target it to multiple services and products and providers, we get much closer to that first way of spending money. You're spending your own money. Yes, these are taxpayer funded, but as Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as public money, right? This is your money. You're spending your own money on your own children. So you have every incentive to economize and to maximize value. So that's why it has worked so well in Arizona and why we continue to see more and more states go the education savings account route relative to a traditional school voucher or tax credit scholarship option. So that was 2011. And Arizona really was the only game in town for a few years. But by 2020, we had gotten up to 5 states with education savings accounts, pretty rapid growth in ESAs. Arizona, Tennessee, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Florida had all adopted the ESA model by 2020. 2021, we see even more rapid adoption of things like ESAs. We have 9 states by 2021 that had an ESA. Missouri there is in blue because they have a tax credit financed ESA. So this is like PhD level school choice policy, right? If you think about how a tax credit scholarship works, right? You've got an individual giving to a nonprofit scholarship granting organization that gives to an individual child to attend a private school of choice. So it's private, 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 all the way through. The money never goes to the hands of the government. So there's a lot of virtue to a tax credit scholarship model. Historically, with the tax credit scholarship on the back end, a kid has received a scholarship, a voucher. What a tax credit funded ESA does is it uses the tax credit scholarship model, so the money never goes to the hands of the state, but on the back end, the child's receiving an education savings account instead of a voucher. So that's a tax credit scholarship. So Missouri pioneered that in 2011. And you see on this slide a little star. That little star is West Virginia. In 2021, West Virginia became the first state to do a universal school choice option. So if we fast forward to 2022, we have still 9 states with ESAs in 2022, but we now have 2 states that have gone universal. So Arizona goes universal with its ESA in 2022. And then the following year, in 2023, we are up to 15 states with education savings accounts, 7 of which are universal. Phenomenal. And then, as I said at the top of this talk today, 2024, we now have 19 states with ESAs or ESA-style accounts, 11 of which are universal. As I mentioned, as of today, Louisiana signed into law the 11th universal school choice program in the country. 9 of the universal programs are universal ESAs. So we have 2 other universal programs that are school vouchers, so traditional voucher options. So we have 13 states in DC that have school voucher options today. 2 of those are universal. And then we have 22 states now that have tax credit scholarships, 3 of which are universal. So if you put all of that together today, We have 30 states plus DC and Puerto Rico that have some form of school choice in place. Again, 22 tax credit scholarships, 13 states and DC have school vouchers, and 19 have ESAs or ESA-style accounts. I say ESA-style accounts, so we have so many options now we can be picky about how we talk about these programs. But I say ESA-style for states like Iowa, for example, where you must first spend your ESA dollars on private school tuition before you do anything else. So it's slightly different than a pure ESA. I say pure ESA because there are states like Florida, Arizona, the majority of ESA states where there is not that stipulation. So we have some kids, for instance, who never set foot in a brick and mortar school at all. Y'all might not like that, but they never set foot in a brick and mortar school at all. And what they do is they take their ESA, they hire a private tutor, they buy textbooks, they purchase curricula, they do a la carte do-it-yourself education. It's not a huge number, but there are a portion of students and families who use their ESA that way. So we have had robust growth in school choice. Looking at the clock there, we have had robust growth, and in fact, we don't even call it school choice anymore, right? It's education choice because of what I just described. So how did we get to this point? This point, as of today with Louisiana, being that 36% of kids across the country are now eligible for private school choice options, 36% of kids. If we get Texas, the next legislative session, anybody from Texas? Okay, I'm looking at you guys. It's up to you. If we get it, next legislative session in Texas, which I feel very good about, more than 40% of kids in the entire country will be eligible for school choice. I mean, that's a tipping point, right, against the situation that we are currently in, where we have this iron triangle of government schooling, right, where you are assigned to a school by government, you are forced to pay for that school through your taxes, and you are compelled to attend, right? K-12 education is compulsory, right? They'll come knock on your door if you don't send your child to school. It is publicly funded with your taxpayer dollars, and largely it is assigned. It is still the case, despite all of this growth, that about 70% of children across the country are in schools they were assigned to by the state. But if we get Texas, and we have 40% of kids across the country eligible for private school choice, that really is a game changer. So how did we get there? How did we get to the point where all of a sudden we're seeing this much success? Yes, of course, COVID, right? It's almost cliche now to bring it up that schools shut down far longer than they needed to shut down, far after we knew it was safe to reopen. A window of opportunity was created. Parents saw what their kids' public schools were teaching, and by and large were shocked by what they saw. When they had to do emergency homeschooling around their kitchen table, they were shocked, and they wanted an exit option. And states have largely delivered. But I would argue that it was a shift in strategy that got us to where we are today. COVID opened that window, but it was what was on the other side, strategically speaking, within the school choice movement that has led to these gains. For the entirety of the school choice movement's history, right, from Milton Friedman in '55 forward, we had largely argued the case for school choice on liberal grounds, right, social justice imperatives, that low-income children, minority children, kids with special needs needed access to schools that worked for them, that were safe, that were effective, and that was, of course, correct, right? These kids are the most deserving of schools that are safe and effective. But that didn't reach a wide swath of constituents to agitate for school choice. We were also making the libertarian argument for school choice, right? The Milton Friedman case that competitive pressure will improve outcomes for all students in all schools across the country, both the kids who exercise choice and the students who choose to remain in the public system. That empirically is true, right? We know this from study after study that we see statistically significant improvements in academic outcomes for children who stay in public schools as more and more private school choice options come and become available to kids. So we know that's true. But ironically, and I say ironically, coming from the Heritage Foundation, we had not been making the conservative case for school choice. So what is the conservative case for school choice? It is the values-based case for choice. right? It is the argument that what matters most to families, more than anything else, is that they can choose learning options and environments that are aligned with their values. Now, that might sound simple, but for a very long time, the movement had been reticent to make the argument that if you are concerned about, for instance, critical race theory being taught in your schools, if you are concerned about sexual orientation and gender ideology, radical gender ideology being taught in your schools, school choice is an answer for you. There was a reticence to tie those two issues together for a long time out of concern that in state legislatures, votes on the left would be lost. Well, it turns out, as my colleague Jay Green has demonstrated, those votes weren't there to begin with. That out of more than 60 private school choice programs that have been passed in the states, something like 2 ever required a single Democrat vote to move forward. At the same time, we had not been preaching to our own choir, right? We may have even lost some conservative votes by not being big enough and bold enough with these policies. And so that was a significant shift, making the values-based case for school choice. And I think that explains much of the success that we're seeing today. So if we look at the great Alexis de Tocqueville, 2 quotes that I think really underscore what education is about. You cannot doubt in the United States the instruction of the people that it serves powerfully to maintain the democratic republic. It will be so, I think, everywhere that the instruction that enlightens the mind is not separated from the education that regulates mores. He also said, I do not consider elementary knowledge as the most potent means to educate the people. It facilitates the study of liberty for them, but it does not give them the art of being free. And I think those are such appropriate and poignant quotes from de Tocqueville on the values-based case for choice. So, what's next? What do we expect over the next few years when it comes to education freedom? I've already mentioned Texas, but I'll mention it again because I want to put pressure on the couple of Texans in the audience to make sure that we get it done. If you follow school choice news closely, you may have seen that there were legislators in Texas, Republican legislators, who did not support school choice in the state. They were primaried on this issue and largely lost and were replaced by members who are supportive of education choice. And that bodes well, I think, for moving school choice forward in the next legislative session. We'll see, of course, what happens. But school choice has become a litmus test for a lot of these members, as it should be. So Texas, keep your eye on Texas. We also may see more of a push at the federal level for education choice. Now, I think that this should raise some concerns, rightly, among advocates of education choice. We have to be ever vigilant of any sort of regulation, be it at the federal or state level, that might follow private school choice onto private schools. Right? The reason parents choose a private education is because they want something different from what the public system can provide. If we overregulate these options, we risk these private schools becoming isomorphic to their public counterparts and limiting the options that are ultimately available to families. So we have to be vigilant at every level of government. However, at the federal level, there are a couple of areas where it is appropriate for Washington to try to advance education choice, and only a few. One is in Washington, D.C. D.C. is under the jurisdiction of Congress. It's a federal city. There's the D.C. Opportunity Scholarship Program, a school voucher option that has been there since 2004. That program, honestly, it's withering on the vine. Every year, people in Congress come after it. They try to overregulate it. So removing regulations from that program, expanding it, and making it universal, that is appropriate for Washington to do. I would also argue that students who are from active duty military families, that is another appropriate constituency for Washington. Education is not an enumerated power of the federal government. Crack open the Constitution, the word education is nowhere to be found. But national security is. National defense is not only an enumerated power, but it is a responsibility of the federal government. And so it makes sense then for the federal government to support the education of military-connected children. Some, and a very few, it's 4% of military-connected kids attend DoD schools, DoDIA schools, and they're excellent, and they serve those families really well, but 96% of military kids attend whatever public school happens to be closest to the base that their military parent gets assigned to. So when you get assigned to your next duty station, your kid is getting assigned to a public school. There was a survey that came out a few years ago from Military Times that found that 1/3 of active duty military members had thought about leaving the military altogether because of the public school their kid would have to attend at their next duty station. We saw that and said there's clearly a need here for us to break the link between military housing and schooling, and to make sure that these service members are well served by their education options. So providing ESAs to military-connected children is another avenue that would be appropriate at the federal level. And then finally, and this is a niche component to talk about, but Native American children who attend Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. If you're deep in education policy, you might be familiar with these schools. They are the worst performing schools in the country. It is a travesty that children are assigned to these schools. If you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, Native American children unfortunately tend to perform at about the bottom when it comes to math and reading outcomes on the NAEP. If you look at Native American children who attend Bureau of Indian Affairs schools operated by the Bureau of Indian Education, they perform 2 grade levels behind their Native American peers in public schools. It is really just terrible, and I think an overlooked area where these children deserve to have access to school choice as well. So those are the 3 areas where I would argue it is appropriate, and we will hopefully see some movement, expanding and making universal the DC voucher program, school choice for kids from active duty military families, and school choice for Native American kids on tribal lands who attend BIE schools. But apart from that, this is really a state issue, but that should make you happy. We are seeing choice go gangbusters in the states. It is amazing the amount of progress that we have seen. Now I'll repeat it one more time, that 3 years ago, not a single state had a universal school choice program, and today that number, as of literally today, is 11. So the dam is breaking. That will accrue to the benefit of not only your schools, but children across the country who will finally be able to access a quality education that is aligned with their family's values. So I'll stop there and open it up to questions. There's a mic coming around if you have any questions or want to throw tomatoes or anything else. Got some off the salad bar. Yes, sir. In the back there.
Thanks for your talk. That was really helpful. I have 5 questions. I'm just kidding.
It's okay.
I do, but I'll only ask one. I'm thinking about regulations. Historically, school choice has been kind of a hush-hush topic for those of us involved with classical Christian education. And the issue has been with the shekels come the shackles.
Right.
Whoever pays the piper picks the tune. And we've been encouraged in the past to have an exit strategy. So say you had a libertarian-minded or conservative-minded governor when it comes to school choice, and then the economics change, and you also, so you got an economic change as well as a more liberal or progressive-minded governor. They come in and they want to take the existing program, which is really good, and that we've become dependent upon potentially if we were to take this whole hog. Because I'm in Indiana, there's ESA for SPED, but not for the general population. But our hesitancy as a board has been, if we take this and then down the road we get a progressive governor and they want to regulate it via teacher training and standards and assessment, what's our exit strategy? Because my hesitancy has been the dependency that could be created. Could you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so great question. It's a question that understandably comes up a lot. My colleague Jay Green at Heritage, he says, yes, you know, with any government money, right? Again, I go back to Thatcher, but with any public funded program, with the shekels can come the shackles, but as he says, you can also get the shackles without the shekels. And we have seen this time and again in states that there are always going to be administrations that will try to overregulate private education even absent any sort of private school choice program. I mean, we can look to the homeschooling sector as a bad, good example of this, where states without any private school choice programs at all have some of the most regulated homeschooling environments in the country. So you can definitely get the shackles without the shekels. But the question for us is, how do we hedge against that? I think there are both theoretical, sort of hypothetical responses to that, and then the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is we haven't seen it yet. Now, granted, these have been small, relatively targeted programs until now, right, until 2024. In Arizona, which is our best example because it's the longest running, and most of the states that have adopted ESAs have followed Arizona's lead, they have been incredibly intentional about two things: writing homeschoolers out and making sure that regulations only apply to transparency around spending. On the first component, at the behest of the homeschooling community, in statute in Arizona's ESA, a student who homeschools is different, distinct in law, from a student who may school at home using an ESA. So that distinction was really important because of what you pointed out. You could get some legislator who, even if they're well-meaning, thinks, oh, we need to regulate that homeschooler because they look an awful lot like the student who is using an ESA to school at home. So they were very clear in that statute that these are two different types of students and that one uses no ESA funds at all. But that's on homeschooling. As far as private education choice goes, the law is written in such a way that it acknowledges there are two forms of accountability. Right, there's accountability for taxpayer dollars, where I think Arizona went appropriately, heavy is not the right word, but they had an appropriate amount of oversight, right? So if you are an ESA family and you get your debit card and you receive your money quarterly onto your debit card, you have to provide to the state of Arizona receipts for your expenses, right? If you don't do that, if you have spent your money in a way that is not articulated appropriately in statute, then you have to rectify the prior quarter's misexpenditure with the next quarter's distribution. So they'll withhold money if you've made a misexpenditure. If there's some egregious misexpenditure, if there's fraud, then they will audit the account. But it has been 0.001%, and the Arizona Auditor General looked at it, of total spending was anything that remotely looked like fraud. So that hasn't been an issue. But I mention all of that to say that I think what they did in terms of splitting out accountability addresses your concerns that yes, there's going to be some oversight on how taxpayer dollars are spent, but when it comes to accountability for academic outcomes, Arizona said that rests with parents, full stop. So there are no state testing requirements. There are no state testing requirements, by the way, in any ESA program. That's a deal breaker for us. We have red lines where we will oppose a school choice program if there is a state testing requirement in it. There is the option in Arizona for families, if they want, to use their ESA for a nationally norm reference test, so something like the Iowa Test of Basic Skills or the SAT. They can use it for that, but there's no requirement to do so. So they kept regulations on academic outcomes incredibly light because they acknowledge that parents are a child's first and foremost educators. Now look, Arizona's another good example. Katie Hobbs comes in and she wants to kill the ESA, right? So what does that mean for schools that are using the ESA and have a large proportion of kids paying with ESA funds? Ultimately, she was not successful. Part of the reason is we have gotten to the point where we have 70,000 kids using the ESA in Arizona. This is part of the strategy of going universal. We want as many families as possible participating. We want every single kid from day one, every single kid, to be funded with an ESA or another school choice mechanism, because the more people you have, the more of a hedge you have against any administration trying to come in and regulate or even kill your program. I will say, so I did my dissertation on school choice in the District of Columbia, and looked at why private schools choose to participate or not participate or participate and then leave the DC voucher program, which is different in terms of regulations than all the ESA options. But one thing that came up is what you mentioned, and that came up several times among private school leaders, and it was something that I think among school choice advocates we hadn't considered from a policy perspective, which was that if you as a private school needed to get a line of credit from a bank, some of these principals said that they thought they appeared riskier in the eyes of the bank if they were a participant in the voucher program. But that was pretty unique because DC relies on an annual appropriations process for their program. So the Obama administration tried to kill the DC voucher every single year. So it looked politically volatile in DC. In places like Arizona and elsewhere, what we are urging now, and as a means of making sure what you described can't happen, is that these programs are formula funded. So in the state formula for education, just like you formula fund public schools, any student in a private school choice program is formula funded. So the risk is diminished greatly. There's not the annual volatility of a politicized appropriations process that can make private schools nervous. So sorry, that was long-winded. You had a lot of components to your question, but that's kind of how we're thinking about it. So, other questions?
Questions, do you have any insight on Tennessee? That's where I'm from, and it doesn't apply to everyone. But I know that last year it got struck down for universal ESAs.
In Tennessee, you said?
Yes, in Tennessee, but Bill Lee's been real bullish about it here lately. I just didn't know if you had any insight.
Yeah, I mean, we're incredibly optimistic. I mean, Tennessee is one of those states that's on our short list of states we think will get a universal program in the near term. And Tennessee was one of the earlier adopters in terms of ESA policy. It was the individualized education program just open to kids with special needs. We've been trying for years and years to move that one forward so it's entirely universal. Yeah, I'm optimistic as more and more states do it. And look, if anybody's familiar with Corey DeAngelis's work, he's kind of become, the guy in school choice policy, really, I think, doing more to advance school choice than anybody besides Milton Friedman over the decades. But he makes a really good point that what we have seen play out, the successes we've seen, is hyper-partisanship as a means to bipartisanship. And so in the states that were willing to go big early on, right, Florida, Arizona, a few others, that it was this values-based case that explains a lot of the progress. But as more and more of these states that were the early adopters do decide to go all in on school choice, it's going to make our Tennessees of the world and other states where we think we've got a really good shot at getting complete universal ESAs in place, it'll make it much more politically palatable for them, right? It's the old Friedman adage, you want to make it, what did he say, politically palatable for the wrong people to do the right things. That's what we're seeing play out with the strategy right now. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that 5 years from now, a majority of kids are going to be in a private school choice program. So, other questions? Got 26 seconds. That was pretty good timing. Oh, one more. I can do it in 25 seconds.
Good, because it's a really lowball question, and I don't know if I just missed this in the term somewhere, but could you please just explain the difference between universal and not universal?
Oh, yeah.
Is that related to a family's income, or how does that work?
Good question. So universal, and honestly, we kind of debate what we consider universal right now. But universal is every single kid in the state is eligible. Not that they're necessarily all using it, right? There's going to be some slow uptake on these programs, but every single kid is eligible to participate, so there's no means testing. So it had been the case historically that most programs were open only to kids from, say, below 250% of the federal poverty line, only open to kids with special needs, only open to kids who are in failing schools, right? So we had limited who could be eligible for these programs. Universal takes all of those eligibility requirements off the table and says, you live and breathe in our state, you have access to school choice. And it makes sense for all of the reasons that I've already mentioned, but think about the fact if Bill Gates has kids, we don't say you can't go to public schools, right? We don't means test public schools, right? We should not means test private school choice options either. So that's the quick difference. So. Great, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the questions and the opportunity to be here.